As has been said before, yes, thank you ever so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk to you. My talk's very much going to focus on kind of the ethical side of this and how to operationalize an effective system, particularly at a university or an institute, where we can take into consideration some of these ethical potential challenges here. Uh, this will work. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background about myself and where I kind of come from and how some of these questions I've formulated. So I started off doing my degrees kind of in law. And when I did my degrees in law, one of the modules I took was all around sort of intellectual property law, copyright matters and that. Once I completed my PhD, I actually moved over to work for the UK Data Archive, where I was kind of leading on the training around research data management. In particular, it was around the kind of legal and ethical considerations with data sharing and how to help effectively share that data from research projects. Whilst also in this role, the GDPR kicked in. And one of my roles became to help the UK Data Archive ensure it was in compliance with that piece of legislation. But in addition to that, part of my work there focused on providing training to researchers around the considerations around GDPR when we're undertaking it for research purposes. And then since coming back to the UEA, my role now, I'm very much involved with the Research Ethics Committee, involved in that. So kind of what I was trying to highlight with this slide is that for myself, I kind of had somewhat of a unique background in that I kind of cross a lot of different camps, which hopefully means that I can bring some form of kind of insight into this area or offer some kind of opinion on it. But also that's what kind of formulated some of my questions when it came to thinking about Gen AI and its use in research. And to be really clear from the start, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be used. I absolutely think it should be used in research, but I think to make sure that we keep that research open, honest, transparent, reproducible, all the kind of cool things that for the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen that shift to ensure we can do, we have to have some of these considerations at the front when we're using that tool. And we just need to make sure we address them at points within it to ensure that we still meet those kind of requirements. Just a couple of quick notes before we start. Any views expressed are obviously going to be my own. They don't necessarily represent the UEA or any of the other institutes like the UK Data Archive that I'm affiliated with. And when discussing the current approach, I think it's really, really crucial to say this right from the outset, that at the UEA, a number of colleagues were involved in this. And this would probably be one of my first key points for anyone who's looking at implementing a kind of system or process effectively within a university or organisation. You have to bring these key teams together to allow them to input into that. So, for example, we had members from RIS involved, we had information compliance involved, IT services, and then you have the researchers themselves. So it's just worth being aware of that. And then also I want to acknowledge one colleague in particular, Dr. Helen Brownlee, who's the UEA's Research Integrity Manager, who really pushed this project along. So one of the key challenges I think we have is this is quite a complex area and you've got to find a way to bring all these people together and keep moving it forward. And Helen was instrumental in doing this. And that's what's allowed us as a university to really, I feel, get ahead of the curve on this and produce some excellent guidance and support for colleagues across the university, whether that be researchers or other staff. I've split the presentation out into three core questions, but as you're going to see, they overlap, and hopefully that will allow you to pull insight from whichever side you're coming from, whether that be yourself as a researcher or someone who's just generally interested in this, or you're someone at an institute thinking we need to put in some kind of operational process here, procedure to support our colleagues. So the first thing we're going to start with is some of the ethical and legal considerations for using generated AI tools within a research project. And Arik's presentation is brilliant because it actually highlighted some of the things I'm going to talk about as well that kind of cropped up in my thinking. So prior to the system we've got at the UEA being implemented, these kind of questions started to appear in my mind about what we needed to look at when we're putting something into the system to allow us to effectively address that. And very much so, as was highlighted, it's what's going on in that AI tool and box. And it's very hard for us to check what's going on unless there is that open information out there about what the tool's doing, how the algorithm operates. And that's going to possibly be a challenge for a number of us unless something is published about that tool or we have a way of knowing more about it. And when you've got that kind of individual protection that they want of that tool for commercial purposes, they're not likely to release too much of that algorithm information. And we've also seen already that there are potentially inherent biases within some tools. A colleague in MBS has done some research which seems to highlight that a number of tools are quite left-leaning, and that's primarily, I believe, based upon the data they've been trained upon. So we need to be aware of these potential risks when we're using that tool. And of course, we all talk about things like hallucinations. The AI tool hallucinates. What we really mean by this, and it's quite interesting for me, I listened to a podcast on BBC Radio 4 where we've humanized these tools already to say they're hallucinations. That's a very much a human thing to think of. What we really mean is they just spew out inaccurate data. They make something up that's not true. And again, that can be down to what the algorithm's based upon and the tool not really understanding what it's being asked. Another question that we would have is, what is the actual data that the tool is trained upon in and of itself? And this is particularly important if we're going to be using it for research purposes, because that could then, of course, have an impact on our research and the findings that we then have. And then we also need to consider, well, how is that data protected? Where is it stored? And who will then inevitably have access to that information? So it's not just the people that create the tool that may have access, but will that information be spewed out to others who are using the tool and inputted into something that they put out? So thinking about what we might put in feeding that machine, what is the data we actually plan on inputting here? Are we going to get participants in our research project to input some information? Are we going to take some information that we've got online and get the tool to kind of analyze that? We then need to consider the actual data itself, whether that will be used to train the tool and then have an influence on future findings. And that might be, depending on the nature of our research project, something that we wouldn't want the participants' data being used to train the tool, because that information we wouldn't want going out in the future. Likewise, we don't know what the future reuse of that data may be or how long it will be used for, and then what the data might do with that. And I think one of the big ones here, which comes up to me, is, well, okay, so we've got participant information perhaps going into that tool. What if a participant withdraws their consent and says, hey, I'd like to be removed from the research project? We know from the ethics side this can happen. What do we do in that situation? Or what would the considerations be? Can we remove that data? And then a really interesting one coming from my background at the archive was around the data linkage considerations. So when I joined the archive, there was very much this big interest in big data. And I'm sure colleagues have heard of the big data lake, where there was this kind of idea that we'd be able to dump all this data in to something and we'd be able to sift out and get really useful information that we'd never considered. But I think with these Gen AI tools, that's something we have to consider. What other research data might have been inputted into this tool, and what data could then potentially be linked from that to perhaps even start identifying new areas and new trends, which is fascinating and interesting, but also the potential risks that might come with that. Could it actually start identifying specific individuals from data sets that we originally thought was somewhat pseudonymized or anonymized, because it can create these linkages because it has that information? And then, as already been pointed out in the fantastic report, what is the quality of that data outputted, regarding the accuracy, the representation, and what's actually been used on it? Then we come on to the interesting one around intellectual property. So who actually owns that information that we input into the tool, and also on with regards to the output? So intellectual property rights cover things such as copyright, design rights, and patents, as well as trademarks. But I think the starting question for the researcher has to be, okay, so who owns the material you want to put in? So if you're doing a secondary research data project where you're using some secondary research data that you've perhaps got from the UK Data Archive or another resource, who owns that information? Do you have the right to then put that information into the tool itself to then have that tool do some analysis on that? Others will talk about things like the research exemption. That's, sorry, what my funny slide on diplomatic immunity was here for anyone who remembers Lethal Weapon. I'm of the generation where I'm old enough to remember that. But the research exemption itself doesn't necessarily protect us when we're thinking about a tool like this, because you're inputting so much copyrighted data into that system. And again, we need to reflect on, okay, so what if we've got participants involved in our research? Can their materials just be inputted into that tool? And what happens about who owns that? Do we have a right to put it in, or can they put it in freely if they wish to? And then who owns the information in the tool itself? So is that the company that produces the tool, or do they have an agreement which says, no, we won't own any of that information which goes in? And of course, that leads us to, well, is it you, the original holder, the participant, the tool itself? And then when that's outputted, has the tool added something to that? So should we be acknowledging that that tool has been involved in this in regards to its kind of author or someone that should be there? And there's differing already standards where some say, no, they shouldn't be listed as an author, and others say they should be listed. And again, we have to consider the risks here around who owns that, the reuse and the loss of novelty. And that, I think, is particularly important when it comes to researchers. So often researchers, we talk about that open agenda of publishing, and that's really, really important. But one of the things we sometimes have to do is embargo that so we can get the data embargoed while we do publications and things like that. Once you put that data into a tool, does that mean another researcher can automatically use it? If it's training the tool itself, then someone else can perhaps have access to that information, or that information could be potentially leaked. So it could actually have an impact on the research regarding publications. And then the final one is thinking about what might be classified as patentable materials. Because of the strict rules around state of the art with this, the standard advice I would give would be, don't put anything that you think that might be patentable into a Gen AI tool, because it'll then possibly become state of the art, and then you'll lose that novelty requirement for it. But again, these are all kind of considerations that have to be had. I won't spend long on this personal data slide. All I really want to highlight with this is everything we've just talked about, those kind of potential considerations, they become a lot more tricky, I feel, when it involves personal data. And the reason for that is not the data itself, it's more about meeting the requirements of the UK GDPR and ensuring we comply with those data protection principles, because it becomes incredibly difficult once that personal data has been input into a tool to enable us to effectively do that. And again, think about the requirements of the GDPR. What is it all about? It's that data protection by design and default. Who's going to be the controller and processor here? If you're inputting personal data, does that mean that now the tool owner is going to become a data controller, or are they just a processor? How will you meet those requirements of the GDPR to get that information out, ensure it's accurate, ensure it's not stored for longer than is needed if you don't own that tool itself? And of course, that requirement for a DPIA to be undertaken, so that's a data protection impact assessment, if personal data is going to be inputted where there's this high risk to the rights and freedoms of individual data subjects. So skimming that slide very quickly, what does this actually mean? And really, it's a reflection of whether you feel you can comply with the data protection requirements. And I think in many cases, the answer to this will probably be no. Even if the participant consented, we still wouldn't be meeting those requirements. So one way around that, to avoid those challenges might be, is there a way we can actually anonymize that information before we put it in a tool first? And then that way, that would take it outside the scope of data protection legislation. We should also consider here confidential data. So there's obviously a business risk if you're inputting confidential business information into that tool for research purposes or for other purposes. And it's likely the university itself will need to take a position on that. And then again, as I mentioned, professional risks for your research. That was what I was talking about on the previous slide, where if you put information in and it outputs that information to another researcher, that could have an impact on your research project itself if the data is already out there. So having said of all these kind of considerations, and I want to be clear, these are not things that stop researchers being able to use generative AI. They are considerations we have to keep doing what we've been doing in the past, thinking about that honesty, transparency, that open research, all of those things that the last 10 or 15 years we've really grown in the research community. So I think you can use it, but the key starting question for me would be, okay, is its use appropriate, useful, and really needed for this project? What's it adding? Is it giving us something that means we should be doing this? And then if you do want to use it, all you really need to do is reflect on everything I've discussed there previously and just see how you're going to address some of those points. And most of them are not insurmountable considerations at all. We just have to figure out how we're going to address them, but they have to be reflected on to ensure we can meet these good ethical standards and practices, and also ensure we comply with our legal requirements. And this next part hopefully will then talk you through how you can do that in practice, whether you're a researcher or an organisation. And what we've actually found, or what you will find here, is that there is an overlap between what the researcher needs to do and what the organisation needs to do really to operationalise that. So what would the researcher want to be considering? So probably one of the first things to start with is, okay, let's look at the tool we plan on using. What is their privacy policy? What is their terms and conditions? What do they say about the tool itself, i.e. the data that is inputted? What do they say? Who owns the copyright? What can be done with that data? How long will it be held? Hopefully you can get some of that information from within the tool's privacy policy and terms and conditions. Now, immediately you might turn around and say, wow, we're now expecting researchers to be experts in reading the law. And this comes back to my later point about how we need to think about how we operationalize this at a university level so that we can provide the support to researchers that they need here. Because we can't expect every researcher to be completely au fait with all of this, though we would hope they have some understanding of it, especially if they're putting participant data into it or requesting participants to do so. If we can get information about the algorithm or perhaps use an open algorithm, that might be a better route to go down. We need to consider those potential risks that we've identified previously, and also those around data linkages, and see what information we can find out about the tool and what they say here with regards to how they might link, or whether the data won't be trained to use be used in the tool to train it, whether you can opt out of training. These are things that we can consider here. One of the other options would be to try and keep the data within the UK or the EU where possible, because often that means that it's going to have that higher standard or meet the GDPR standards. But if you are going to think about inputting personal data or confidential information, realistically, that needs to be a talk with whatever the Institute's information compliance team before the start, so that that DPIA can be undertaken and these more serious considerations can be had. And if you're planning on inputting secondary data, think about here the permissions, about whether that has been made openly available online and whether the copyright allows you to and permits you to put it into a tool. I wonder whether in the future we will see sort of statements that go out with research data or publications which say this data can be used and can be inputted into a Gen AI tool for further analysis or something like that. That might be where we see the sector move on this. Thinking about that transparency and consent. So this is something over the years we've really built on, and we've always talked about getting that informed consent from participants. And when it comes to the use of Gen AI, what we need to do here is try and inform the participant of as much information around the tool as possible so they can make that informed consent decision. So they make the decision whether they feel the tool is appropriate. So we've got to let them know about what its involvement will be in the project, any risks we are aware of with the tool, inform them about the potential future reuse. Could we, for example, offer them the ability to still take part in the research, but not the Gen AI part if they wish to, so they can opt out of using Gen AI? Or does Gen AI go to the root of the research project where if you're involved in it, you have to use it? The idea is letting them to decide, in essence. So when it then comes to thinking about publications, just sort of pulling in here, I think it's also worth ensuring we attribute what the Gen AI tool used or did. So it might be we list exactly what the inputs were into that tool, what version of the tool was, the date we did this, and then all of the outputs that the tool produced. So you have a copy of that. That would be a way potentially of having that reproducibility or that accountability, because you would have that. And maybe that becomes somewhat of an appendix or something that's added to the research project or the research publication. So someone can see exactly what the tool did and said, and then what your outcomes from that were. But again, from accountability perspective, the researcher has to take that responsibility for the use of the generative AI tool within their research project, like they do for all the other areas. So let me show you what this looks like in practice. So how do we embed this into a participant information sheet or a PIS? Because it's important to keep them informed. So at the UEA, because this requires kind of quite a lot of specialism in drafting a legally compliant PIS form, we've actually opted to create a template which can then be adapted by researchers. And we have this accessible through one of our websites for them. And what I wanted to just do with these slides very quickly is highlight what that might look like. So for example, within the what will the study involve section, the text that you see in green on the slide, and all these slides will be shared with yourselves at a later date, so don't worry, you can kind of go through and read all of this. Then it's about informing the participant about the Gen AI usage and what that actually means within that. And for example, if you have to be in the study and someone chooses to withdraw, of course, we always say a participant can withdraw, but we need to be really clear here what that means if any information has been put in a Gen AI, because you can't withdraw that typically from a Gen AI tool. So we need to be clear to participants so they understand that right from the outset. And likewise, within the consequences section for withdrawing, and again, with regards to risks, we want to include a little bit of information about the risks associated with using the generative AI tool in the study. So for example, the data may stay in the tool, it might be used in future research or in future outputs from the tool, so that the participants are aware of this. Again, we can also add other sections into what will happen with the data which is collected during the study. So if it involves the AI usage, it will go into the AI tool, whatever information we have on how long it will be staying there, that it can't be removed, whether it will be used to train the tool, these kind of things. And then within the consent form part of the participant information sheet, we need to make sure that they understand that. So we need to insert a statement on that. And then one of the key things that is really important, I think, with when we talk about gaining informed consent, um, particularly in the social sciences field, and it's something that we were developing when I was at the UK Data Archive, is we love the idea of a granular consent broken down to a yes and no. I hate seeing consent forms personally which just have a yes tick box because it automatically implies that you have to tick the yes box. There should be a no box on that form as well. And here what you can see is we've added in the red two tick boxes that can be added. One saying, yes, I agree for my data to be input into the Gen AI tools. And yes, you're okay for that use of that Gen AI tool, and explaining here what that might be specifically. And that doesn't mean that a participant still can't take part in the research, because if they can still do part of the research but not be involved in the Gen AI side, that's fine, they can still take part. But if the whole research is obviously based on using this tool, and that has to be, and at this point they would have to come out with the research project immediately when they do the consent form at the start. But again, it's getting that informed consent, which is what we've spent years talking about and the importance of from an ethical point of view. So how does the university operationalize this? So as you just saw there, that PIS, we could ask researchers to draft that up, and there are some researchers I know that would be able to do that. But given the uniqueness of it, it's probably likely that us in the profession, whether that be from the data management team, from the research side, from the ethics side, we want to help support colleagues with that. So having an institutional form which can be adapted will likely support there, and just adding those Gen AI bits in could be really useful. We've created a separate one for the Gen AI usage. You need to bring all those interested parties together, like I said at the start. So getting a policy or procedure through means you need to bring these teams together. It might not be that you need to bring them all together in one place. You can do little bits and bobs and then move it around, but you will need these people involved in that kind of discussion process. So the UEA, we have a Gen AI policy. I've put the link on the slides there, so you can access that and see what our policy looks like. And then this needs to be reviewed regularly because the area and field is just moving so fast. Alongside this, one of the key things for myself, having worked at the UK Data Archive, was we have a policy, but then I really value having something which is clear and easy to understand from a researcher's perspective. You can have a policy, that's great, but it can be quite legal, it can be quite heavy and dense. So let's actually pull that apart and make it into some form of guidance that is easily digestible, gives researchers really straight, clear forward, this is what you should be doing, this is who you should be speaking to. And we've produced a guidance note based upon that to really support here the policy itself. And I think that's something else that an institute needs to do to operationalize it, alongside provide training on it. So just to speak quickly of the UEA process, we decided to embrace the use of Gen AI. We said, okay, there's no reason not to embrace using it, not just within teaching and learning, but also within research. We cannot remove every risk. And I think this is the same if you speak to any data protection officer when it comes to data protection matters or anything like that. We know we cannot actually remove every single risk. So what it is about managing the risks as best as possible and identifying where those issues might crop up. And we have tried to do that with our policy and the guidance note. And again, really, the policy is about supporting research use of this, because as Eric was saying, it's really important for society that we do use this Gen AI for research. It's going to have a huge impact on what it can and can't do. But we've just got to think about making sure we've got some kind of protective mechanisms in place that consider some of these issues. So the next point I'll speed up, sorry, James. The next point is considering, are you going to have an institutionally approved tool, a specific tool that you say, here's the Gen AI tool you should use, or are you not going to have a centrally approved tool? So researchers say, well, I want to use this tool, which is good at this, or this tool that's good at that. This is a consideration the organization has to have, and that will then impact everything else that happens around the way you structure your system, your processes. But you will ask the same questions of that tool. Potentially, it's just you might have to do it for lots of different tools. But the one thing I would say is if you have a centrally approved tool, the area and field is moving so quickly, it can become quite challenging to keep up with that and have the best tool for the best purposes. We've got lots of different Gen AI tools which can be used in different ways here. This is just to show you the UEA process, and I think this is a great overview. So if the tool's using personal data, then we need to bring in the information compliance team. If it is, then we need the cybersecurity risk assessment brought in by the IT information security team as well. If you need to install software, so you can kind of see how this works. But what we have within the system is we've created a light touch review group. And the idea with this is that we have some form of oversight of all the different tools that might be being used across research, so that we know which ones we might want to try and get approved in the long term, or so we can speed up the process for researchers. Um, and then the other thing, very quickly, we use Ethics Monitor, and one of the ways we've done this is to embed all of the things you saw me talk about right at the start. We've tried to transfer these thoughts and reflections into questions within Ethics Monitor. And what should happen in this process is researchers will basically complete the Ethics Monitor system, but before they submit it, they come to the light touch review group to get that permission. Then they submit their ethics application. What this does is it means that it takes that pressure away from the Research Ethics Committee chairs, expecting them to know all about AI, but we have a light touch review group who have done that work and said, we approve on this part of the study with the Gen AI with these considerations. So that removes that from the Research Ethics Committee itself. Again, you'll see this all on the slides, but I wanted to show you the kind of questions we were asking, which hopefully you'll see mirror up to a lot of the kind of considerations I put at the beginning of the presentation. And then that just gets noted within the system and then gets submitted. Final thing, sorry, James, is just to say this was published yesterday by my colleague Helen Brownlee and Tracy, and this actually shows you a bit of a blueprint, perhaps, of the steps that we took as an organisation, how we went through it, and how your organisation may wish to look at all of this and then think about embedding it itself. It's accessible at the link on my slides, and maybe that can be popped in the chat as well. If Helen's with me still, she can chuck it in the chat for everyone. So yeah, if there's any questions, comments, or observations, you can reach out to me at my UA address, but I'm happy to take some now as well. Sorry, that was a bit rushed.
Scott, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you, and to Arik for the two great presentations. We are now at 11, but and I appreciate some people have go, but we'll just take a few questions. That would be great before we close the event. We will be making an edited recording of the event available, and it and slides of both presentations will be coming up on UKRIO's website in the next week or so. And also the recording will be on our YouTube channel. Okay, so in terms of questions, we've had quite a few, and right. Okay, so how you suggested at one point anonymizing data, asked Tegan, before it is inputted into AI, but how do you manage the risk of data linking re-identifying that data?
Absolutely fantastic question. So I think we could try and do what we standardly do when we anonymize data, remove the direct identifiers, take the indirect identifiers out, et cetera, et cetera. But it highlights one of my core concerns when we input personal data into the tool, even if it's anonymized. We don't know what other data has been inputted into that tool. So we've got no guarantees that it couldn't link it. So I think one way around it might be that we ensure the data doesn't train the tool. So we need to make sure that option's there. But the other way could be we consider using only an open tool, which is very clear on the usage of it. I think anything that's personal data is a challenging one, even once it's anonymized to put in. So I think it's a consideration, but I wouldn't want to come out and say, it should never be done, because that would feel quite prohibitive. Maybe we can have a specific Gen AI tool created for research purposes, which then silos that data. Maybe that's something that needs to be developed and created by a body. Yeah, not.
That's really helpful,
Yeah.
thank you. Another question relating to ethics. Chandrika asks, in qualitative research with people and children, would the inclusion of AI in the participant information sheet potentially discourage their participation or cause worry, as they may not, and also would they relate to what the implications of Gen AI would be for a member of the public as an individual? So perhaps, I think that's suggesting maybe we need to sort of upskill participants as well so they fully understand the implications.
Yeah, again, another really great point. And I think this also comes down to when we think about the PIS form itself, this should not be a form that we as researchers just provide to an individual and say, here you go, read this and ask many questions. We really need to go through that process with them. And particularly when it involves Gen AI, we need to highlight what those potential risks are to the participants, and we may not be fully aware of all of those ourselves, even as researchers. So I think it's drawing that look, we don't know how this data might be used in the future. If we can't stop the tool being trained on it, there could be risks related to that, but we need to walk those participants through it. Particularly when it comes to vulnerable participants that are at more risk, we have to, I think, as researchers, really consider, do we need to use that Gen AI in this project? Or do we need to give even more information to those people to make sure they understand as best as possible what those risks are? Because again, this to me goes right back to not just the fact that it's Gen AI, but it goes back to what we've been doing for years. We need to get that informed consent. We need that to be good, and we need to give the participant that choice, as much information as possible. So we've got to give them that transparency, or as to the best of our ability that we can.
Absolutely. There's the professional duty to give transparency, and also that transparency, I feel, leads to better research as well as better safeguarding for participants. We'll take one final question, if we may. Alice says natural language processing research seems to be increasingly popular, and many researchers may be wanting to train their models on data sets from open secondary data repositories such as Kaggle. And in these sets, consent and integrity details may not be clear. What do you think research ethics committees need to be careful with when reviewing studies using data sets to train AI when those studies aren't, say, published in accessible and peer-reviewed journals?
Yeah, again, another really great question. So I think part of the consideration here has to be around the usage of that data. So what was the license on it? What information do we have about it? Now, Kaggle, along with another of other providers, can end up with data being deposited, which actually isn't that individual's data. So they take data from somewhere else and then just redeposit it there. So we always have to look at where that data has originated from, if possible. So go back to the original source. What were the licensing conditions on that information, on that data right from the start? And then that can hopefully inform that decision. I wonder whether there may be some kind of government license which eventually comes out, or some kind of license where we can have that permits people to train or use it in AI going forward. So we may actually, as a community, need to say we're happy for this data to be trained or this data not to be trained. It's such a fast-moving area; it's very difficult. But I think copyright would be one of my starting points. Then I would look at the nature of the data as well. So what are the associated risks with that specific data in question? Is it high risk data which might lead to someone being identified? And then if that would be a risk, I would want to be considering that. And again, what tool are they looking to put it in? Will it be used to train it? And thinking further about how it might be reused would be the kind of starting point. Sorry, there isn't really a clear answer I can give. It's kind of, there's a lot of considerations, and then based on the case facts, would then perhaps determine whether I felt that was something we could ethically approve or not.
Scott, thank you so much for that presentation, for the Q&A. That was really insightful.